April 1945. The war in Europe is nearing its end. The Nazi regime is collapsing, and Allied forces are advancing across Germany. Cities fall one by one, and with them, the horrifying truth of the concentration camps is revealed to the world. Among them is Dachau, one of the first and most infamous Nazi camps. For over a decade, it has been a place of suffering, death, and inhuman cruelty. As the war reaches its final days, the prisoners of Dachau live through their darkest hours. Hunger, disease, and mass executions are wiping them out, while the SS desperately tries to cover up their crimes. But on April 29th, everything changes. The U.S. Army is approaching. For the thousands still trapped behind barbed wire, hope is on the horizon. This is the story of the last days of Dachau, the suffering, the liberation, and the justice that followed. Dachau was more than just a concentration camp. Pages of the past. It was the first of its kind, opened in 1933, just weeks after Adolf Hitler seized power. Initially, it was designed for political prisoners, opponents of the Nazi regime, journalists, and intellectuals who dared to speak out. But as the years passed, Dachau evolved into a model for the entire Nazi camp system. Tens of thousands of people, Jews, Romani, clergy, resistance fighters, and prisoners of war, were sent here. Brutality and forced labor were everyday realities. Prisoners were subjected to inhumane medical experiments. Hunger, disease, and executions became a part of life. By 1945, Dachau had become more than just a prison. It was a factory of death. Over 200,000 people had been imprisoned here, and more than 40,000 had perished. With the Third Reich collapsing, the SS now faced a dilemma. What to do with the surviving prisoners? Their solution would be as cruel as everything that had come before. By April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Munich, chaos consumed Dachau. SS guards, realizing their inevitable defeat, received conflicting orders. Some instructed them to evacuate the camp, while others demanded that no prisoners be left alive. On April 26, 1945, the infamous death marches began. Thousands of skeletal prisoners were forced to march without food or water. Those who could not keep up were brutally executed on the spot. Survivor David L. recalled, "Out of 150 people crammed into the cattle car, only 3 of us made it out alive. I was one of them." Inside the camp, conditions were catastrophic. Overcrowded barracks, severe food and water shortages, and rampant disease turned Dachau into a living hell. The crematorium could no longer keep up with the number of bodies, and corpses were left piled in mass graves or scattered across the camp. Those who remained lived in constant terror, uncertain if they would be massacred before the Allies arrived. For them, hope and despair had become indistinguishable in those final days. April 29, 1945. The 42nd Infantry Division, the 45th Infantry Division, and the 20th Armored Division of the U.S. Army approach Dachau. Reports suggest a concentration camp, but nothing could have prepared the soldiers for what they were about to witness. As they moved closer, they encountered train cars, dozens of them, filled with corpses. The bodies are skeletal, their faces frozen in agony. Some soldiers assumed the victims had been dead for weeks, but then they notice movement. Some are still alive, barely clinging to life. Private First Class Ralph G. remembers, "I had seen death before, but this was something else. The smell, the sheer scale of it, I can never forget it." As the troops breach the gates of Dachau, they find thousands of prisoners, starved, sick, barely able to stand. Some collapse in relief, others stare in disbelief. The soldiers are overwhelmed by the horror around them. Brigadier General Felix L. Sparks, one of the officers on the scene, later wrote, "Nothing in my experience had prepared me for the sights I witnessed that day. The world needed to see this place, to understand the depths of Nazi cruelty." The nightmare of Dachau was finally over, but for the U.S. soldiers, their mission had only just begun. The liberation of Dachau was not just an act of rescue, it was also a moment of reckoning. As American troops entered the camp, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses, and the infamous death train. Dozens of boxcars filled with dead bodies, their skeletal remains telling a story of unspeakable suffering. Shock and rage spread through the soldiers. Among them was Lieutenant Jack Walsh, one of the first to order fire on German troops near the train. The remaining SS guards were quickly rounded up and taken to a coal yard inside the camp. Many had already been beaten by American troops. It was at this moment that Sergeant Walsh ordered a .30 caliber machine gun to be brought to the scene. Between 50 and 150 SS men stood lined up against a wall when Walsh, accompanied by a small group of about 10 soldiers, gave the order. "Let them have it." Gunfire erupted. For 30 seconds, bullets tore through the air as rifles, pistols, and the machine gun cut down the SS men. Suddenly, Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks arrived at the scene. He rushed to stop the shooting and put an end to the chaos. Later, he recalled, "I wasn't sure if I could stop it. The men were consumed with rage." Yet, justice in Dachau was not only carried out by the American soldiers. The former prisoners who had endured years of torture, humiliation, and the loss of their comrades also unleashed their fury. Some SS guards were beaten to death, others were drowned in the camp's canals, while some were bludgeoned with rifle butts. A military investigation followed, but no formal charges were brought against the American troops. The war was still raging, and in the eyes of many soldiers, Dachau had become not just a place of liberation, but a place of justice. Justice that had come far too late for tens of thousands who had perished. For years, the prisoners of Dachau had lived in constant fear. Starvation, disease, and brutal executions had become their daily reality. When the gates of the camp were finally thrown open on April the 29th, 1945, many could not believe what was happening. Some collapsed from exhaustion, unable to comprehend that the nightmare was over. Others broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the sight of the American soldiers. A few, too weak to stand, simply stared in disbelief, their hollow eyes reflecting years of suffering. One American soldier recalled, "They didn't cheer, they didn't celebrate. They just looked at us, as if they couldn't understand that they were free." But for some, the moment of liberation was not just about relief, it was about revenge. Many prisoners, despite their weak and skeletal state, turned on their former captors. SS guards who had not been executed or arrested were dragged into the streets and beaten. Some were lynched by furious survivors, their bodies left in the very same places where they had once tortured others. An eyewitness described the scene. "I saw prisoners chasing down an SS man. They had no weapons, just their bare hands. When they caught him, they didn't stop until he was dead." Others, however, had no energy left for vengeance. Their bodies were broken, their spirits shattered. Some simply laid down where they stood, too weak to move. American medics rushed to provide care, but for many, help had come too late. Over the next few days, survivors were fed, treated, and evacuated. But the trauma of Dachau would never leave them. They had survived, but at a cost beyond comprehension. One survivor later wrote, The war ended for the world in May 1945. For us, it never really ended. The nightmare of Dachau was over, but for those who had survived, liberation was only the beginning of another battle, the battle to rebuild their shattered lives. Many prisoners were so emaciated that even the smallest portions of food could kill them. American medics and aid workers struggled to provide care, but despite their efforts, hundreds of survivors perished in the days following the liberation. For some, the psychological wounds ran even deeper. Years of torture, starvation, and loss had left scars that no amount of food or medicine could heal. One survivor later recalled, "I had forgotten what it meant to live outside those walls. Freedom felt unreal, like a dream I might wake up from at any moment." As survivors tried to recover, the world turned its attention to those responsible for the horrors of Dachau. In November 1945, the Dachau trials began, one of the first war crimes tribunals of the post-war era. 36 SS officers and camp officials were put on trial. The evidence was undeniable. Mass graves, eyewitness testimonies, and the chilling records kept by the Nazis themselves. The verdict was swift. 28 were sentenced to death, while the rest received long prison terms. Yet justice was not always absolute. In the coming years, some sentences were commuted, and many lower-ranking officers escaped punishment altogether. Meanwhile, the survivors faced an uncertain future. Many had no homes to return to. Entire families had been wiped out, cities reduced to rubble. Some stayed in displaced persons camps for months or even years, waiting for a place to rebuild their lives. But even in the face of unimaginable loss, many refused to let their suffering define them. They rebuilt, they remembered, and they told their stories, so that the world would never forget what happened in Dachau. One survivor wrote, "We were the living proof of what had been done. The world had to see us, to hear us, so that no one could ever say it didn't happen." Conclusion. The liberation of Dachau was a moment of justice, but it did not erase the suffering that had taken place behind its walls. For tens of thousands, freedom came too late. For those who survived, the memories never faded. Today, the Dachau concentration camp memorial stands as a reminder of the horrors of the past, a place where history speaks and where silence tells a story of its own. What are your thoughts on this chapter of history? Let me know in the comments. If you found this video meaningful, consider subscribing for more stories from the past. History must be remembered so that it is never repeated. Thank you for watching. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Santayana.